without saying that Florida State is going to be one of the biggest storylines in all of college football. I mean, all things considered, we've never really seen a program go from 13-1 like they did to 2023 and tank down all the way to 2-10 back in 2024. I mean, it's just quite frankly unprecedented. And, there are a number of things that kind of happened. It didn't really go their way. Obviously, the DJ ukulele experiment didn't work out. They were decimated with injuries on the defense side of the ball. The offensive line was absolutely atrocious, and the running game was really nowhere to be seen. And now going into 2025, everybody knew they had to make a number of changes in order for them to really get to the next level. We know that they got rid of Alex Atkins and they have Gus Malzahn as their offensive coordinator now. They bring in Tony White from Nebraska to be their defensive coordinator, who also had a stint at Syracuse. So he's somebody who's well experienced, well versed in the world of college football. And I think somebody who's going to be a pretty big asset to them moving forward. And as you look at this roster, there's definitely a lot of potential. And what I mean by that is I think what Florida State decided to do, that was what was a little bit different than previous years in terms of the transfer portal, is I think they definitely betting on a lot more guys who have shown some serious evidence that they can contribute way quicker. I think what they did back in 2023 and 2024 was they kind of bet on a lot of guys who had a higher ceiling, higher potential type of guys. And, unfortunately, that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles sometimes in terms of you bet on some of these guys and you pay them some money and it may or may not work out. And as I look at some of the guys that they got, I mean, the first guy that always comes to my mind is Squirrel White coming in from Tennessee. The guy's electric. He's fast. I mean, we saw probably a number of times last year where he was outrunning Nico's throws last year. And he's somebody who can be a really big dynamic threat for them, somebody who's be able to stretch the field. And most importantly, someone that Castellanos can rely on some big moments too. And, obviously you got Duce Robinson too. Granted, I don't think he's necessarily a number one receiver, but I think White and Robinson combined together are going to be two guys that I think Castellanos can rely upon. And I do think it's going to bring out a little bit less pressure on this rushing attack too. And, based on what we've seen too, I think it's fairly obvious that Florida State is planning on running the ball. I mean, you saw all the upgrades that they made on the offensive line. They brought in a number of transfers from the SEC, from the Big Ten. So to me, everything is shaping up that they're going to end up being a primarily running first team. And granted, I think Castellanos is a strong quarterback. I think the stats are a little bit misleading in terms of what people might think about him. The whole thing with him in Boston College in 2024, it didn't quite pan out that way. I think realities at Boston College kind of wanted to go a different direction. I think Castellanos at the time was a little bit limited in terms of him being a thrower. And it just got to a point where I think Bill O'Brien just pretty much felt like, hey, we've maximized what we think we can get out of him. And Castellanos probably just felt like, hey, it was best for me to move on at that point. And to me, Florida State is the perfect situation for him. He's still starting. He has a really good amount of D1 experience, and he has experience under Malzahn back when he was at UCF before his stint at Boston College too. So to me, it seems like a really good pairing for everybody involved too. And I talked about UCF on the show before too, and especially last year, I was really high on UCF going into that October window too, and then everything just kind of fell apart for them. I mean, you had RJ. You've seen what they can do with RJ Harvey. They had KJ Jefferson too, and I guess in many ways, when I look back and I think of UCF and I think of Gus Malzahn's time at Auburn, I think there was a lot of comparability to some of those quarterbacks. And I think to myself, hey, if Gus can get the best out of Cam Newton as a throwing and a running quarterback, why can't they do the same thing with Castellanos? Now, granted, Castellanos is a guy who is a legitimate dual threat, who is, moves way faster than what his body would say. What I mean by that, he's a pretty big dude. He's somebody who can break tackles. He's somebody that you can rely upon for those, 3rd and 1s, those 4th and 1s, those kind of crunch situations where you only need a couple yards here and there. But the biggest question with Florida State's offense, it's going to all come down to Castellanos, and I hate to be like that in terms of, oh well, everything kind of comes down to the quarterback, or oh, everything comes down to one player. But when you bring in a guy like Malzahn, I mean that's pretty much what you're asking. You're pretty much putting out to the universe, hey, our plan is to run it down people's throats. We're going to bring in Squirrel White. We're going to bring in Robinson. We're going to bring in some fresh faces. They also really did a phenomenal job bringing in some tight ends too, which to me further supports that they're going to be running the ball even more. But given all those fresh faces too, and yes, they're going to have to tweak some things, and they're going to need a lot of production out of those guys really quick. But to me, what feels a little bit different, like I said before, is the fact that a lot of these guys have legit D1 experience. And for the most part, a lot of these guys only have 1 year of eligibility left. And if you're looking at this strictly in terms of Mike Norvell's job situation, now if we're talking about strictly from his contract, yeah, he should be safe because, my understanding is I think he still has a couple years on his contract left. And, Florida State has another year like they did last year. If they go anywhere near that 3-9, 4-8 window, you're probably going to have to pony up the money to get rid of them. But at the same time, too, I think from a, personnel perspective, they did everything they really could have done. I mean, I really love the addition of Tony White coming in from Nebraska. My man, Dylan Jurgens, I had him on a couple months ago talking about Nebraska right when Florida State hired Tony White. And that was a real loss. And I think somebody who is really an underappreciated coach in all of college football. And I think someone who's going to make an immediate impact on this program. But if you're looking at from a personnel perspective in terms of Tony White, a lot of his defense, much like Nebraska last season, was primarily predicated on their linebacking core. And, if you look at their transfer portal and you look at what they've kind of built in terms of recruiting, they spent the majority of their time on the defensive line, and rightfully so. I mean, they definitely were missing some key pass rushers. And, if you go back and think of the earlier Mike Norvell era, you think of Jared Vase, Braden Fisk, Jermaine Johnson, Trey Benson, all those guys who, were some phenomenal players. But they're gonna have to tweak some things out, and I guess I'm really fascinated to see how exactly Florida State's defense is going to look differently this year. And basically, from what I've seen in Nebraska last year, I expect them to be a lot more aggressive in terms of defensively. I don't anticipate seeing as many explosive plays. Now, granted, the secondary is still going to be kind of a question mark for Florida State. I mean, if you go back in last year, there was a number of games where they gave up 300 plus passing yards, and granted, yes, they've been decimated by injuries too. And, you can only use that crux to a degree. But yet again, Florida State's in a spot where, yes, they've had to make the major changes. And I think if you're a Florida State fan, I mean, you really can't get any worse compared to last season. And when I look at what they've brought in, I look at the coaching staff they brought in, and most importantly, I look at the schedule too. I think there's more reason to be optimistic than pessimistic here, because when I look at this Florida State schedule, I think if you were just looking at it from a quick glance, you would say to yourself, I don't know, that could be a kind of a tricky schedule. I mean, because the ACC is one of those conferences where it's really going to be unpredictable. And I know I say this narrative over and over again in terms of unpredictability, but the ACC is really one of those conferences that I genuinely say that to myself almost every single year, which is obviously a really fun problem to have. But let's think for a second. When you're Florida State, I'd say two most important programs that I'm pretty relieved about that you don't have to face this year is you don't have to face Louisville, you don't have to face Georgia Tech, and you don't have to face Boston College. I mean, those are three teams right there that I think to myself, hey, I'd be pretty happy that they're not on my schedule. However, you still have to play Miami. You still have to play Clemson, unfortunately. They start off the year, fortunately, at home versus Alabama, and I think that's really going to be a fascinating game to watch, because I think it's going to take a little bit for Florida State to really gel this together too. And let's just say it's a total ass whooping against Bama, and Bama just creams them. You go in and you face Eastern Texas A&M, you have Kent State, you have Virginia. So worst case scenario, you should be 3-1. And even you should be taking care of Virginia too. So that's already 4 wins, and you're already maximizing having more wins than you did in 2024. So you're already heading in the right direction. And granted, you have some tricky games versus Pitt and Stanford and all that, but I think to me the real stretch that they're going to have is going from November 8th to November 22nd. So fortunately, you do have to go on the road versus Clemson, who I think we can all agree is probably the favorite in the ACC and probably a top 5 team in the country right now. And if Florida State really wants to kind of solidify themselves as a program who is going to be on the rise again, as somebody who needs to be respecting the ACC, that's going to be a game that I think is going to be penciled among everybody in college football, especially if we wave our crystal ball and they take care of business like they should. I mean, even if they go on a big win streak and the only games they lose are to Alabama and Miami, I mean, you're sitting pretty good right now at what, 6-2? 6-2. You'd be sitting at 6-2 right there. I mean, even if you go 6-3, then you build at least a little bit of momentum to the point where you play against a really tough Virginia Tech team who, yes, they have their question marks, but they're at the point where if Brett Pry can kind of figure out some of those game management decisions, Kyron Drones can kind of make of his own, and the defense can come together, that's going to be a really tricky game, even though that they're home. And obviously NC State too. They're always going to be a tough challenge no matter what. Dave Doran is, phenomenal coach, well respected, and somebody who can really get the maximize the players that he's had. And granted, they've had a little bit of difficulty in terms of the quarterback room. I mean, I go back and think of Devin Leary, I think of Grayson McCord, and they've kind of had some bad luck there. So they could be a team that's have a little bit more eyes on this year. But I go back and I talked about Alabama, I talked about Miami and Clemson and Florida. If everybody really wants to see Florida as a team that you're establishing that credibility again, I think you have to find a way to win one of those games. I'm not saying you got to win every single one, but to me, I look at this Florida game that they really got to try to find a way to win. And I say that because I think a lot of us, to a fault, don't really talk about some of the early year. So granted, even if they did beat Alabama, which by the way would be an absolute stunning victory, they're not going to get the credit that they deserve, because what if they completely crap the bed after? Then it almost undermines that victory. And I'm not saying that's accurate. I'm not saying that I even agree with that premise. I just know in the day and age of college football, of the playoff, of everything, that everybody likes to look at things as the now, not as the before. So teams don't get as much credit for some of those earlier wins compared to what they do now, because obviously people see what ends up actually happening versus what it was back then. But if you're a Florida State fan, I think there's a good reason to be optimistic, and that's coming from a Gator guy myself here, as somebody who primarily covers the Gators. I think you have a pretty favorable schedule, all things considered. Granted, you have to play Alabama, Clemson, and Florida, all really tough programs to play. But nevertheless, a lot of these conference games you can definitely take care of. You have a couple softballs at the beginning of the season, and I think the bye weeks are in some pretty ideal spots, especially, hey, you get the bye week after you have to travel to Stanford. You give yourself a week to get ready, and then you go against Jake Dickard's Wake Forest and hopefully take care of business there. Then you go on that 3-game stretch, which I think is going to be the toughest part of their season.